Deuteronomy 6:5 says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." There is no better life than a life that's full of love. Can you imagine loving with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength? This is how God expects us to live. This is how He's prepared us to live through Jesus. What is loving the Lord with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength? That's this week's message. If we go back a few verses to verse 1 in chapter 6, it says this: "These are the commands, decrees, and laws that the Lord your God directed me to teach you, to observe in the land you are crossing the Jordan to possess." We know that in the Old Testament, when the people of Israel crossed over the Jordan, it was a reflection of us in the New Testament crossing over through Jesus into this new life that we are to possess. It says here, "So that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live, by keeping all His decrees and commands that I give you, and that you may enjoy long life. Hear, Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing of milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of our ancestors, promised you." It said, so that you can increase, so that you can live your best life. We read verse 5 already. Now let's go ahead to verse 6. "These commands that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, and when you walk along the road, and when you lie down, and when you get up. Tie them as symbols around your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates." His will plus our willingness is the recipe for our best life. But oftentimes, we want to take control. We want to take matters into our own hands. We want to control the timing. We want to control the situation. We will even want to control the path we're on. But listen to what it says in Job chapter 12. "Ask the animals, and they will teach you, or the birds in the sky, they will tell you. Or speak to the earth, and it will teach you. Let the fish of the sea inform you. Which of these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In His hand is the life of every creature, and the breath of all mankind." We need to remember His strength carries us through all things. We've all heard Philippians chapter 4, verse 13. It says, "I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength." This isn't just for NBA championships, Steph Curry. This is for the good, the bad, and the ugly. All times, all situations, all moments in our life, we can do all things through Christ who gives us strength. Listen, putting our heart and our soul and our strength into Him is committing our life into His hands. Let's examine 3 things for living in His hands. These come as we lay our life down. In Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, it says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed in the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good and pleasing and perfect will." The first thing that you and I have to be willing to do to put our life in his hands is we must be willing to sacrifice. It says in Genesis chapter 22, sometime later, God tested Abraham. And he said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for a place God had told him about. Abraham was willing to sacrifice his own son. Now don't worry. God had never intended for Abraham to sacrifice his son. He provided a substitute if you keep reading. No, God wasn't going to kill Abraham's son. God was going to do that with his own son generations later. But more than the shock of a man sacrificing or killing his own son, let's look at what God asked of Abraham. You see, God had promised that Abraham would be the father of many nations. He said his descendants would outnumber the sands on the shore, that his descendants would outnumber the stars in the sky. And here we are now, Abraham having to lay down this promise, lay down his own son. Sacrifices are never easy. That's why they're called sacrifices. But for you and I to live in God's hand, where we are full of life, where we are full of love, where he is in control, we've got to be willing to die to ourselves, let ourselves completely go, and place ourselves in his hand. But Abraham wasn't always so willing. If you go back and read, you'll see that there was a point where Abraham and Sarah, his wife, were trying for decades to conceive Isaac. And so at one point, they took matters into their own hands and decided to help God out by bringing in one of their servants and conceiving a child there. And of course, that wasn't God's plan. And I believe we are still impacted by that decision even today, thousands of years later. But with the willingness to sacrifice must also come obedience. I've shared the story many times about Misty and I at the beginning of our marriage moving halfway across the country. It seemed like all the way across the universe to us at the time. But we moved from Dallas to Los Angeles. And I vividly remember a moment as we were driving through the mountains. We came around a curve and the sky opened up and I saw the clouds. And for me then, and even still today, the sky and the clouds are often something I look to find peace. It's just something bigger than me. And I knew in that moment that I would not be able to have peaceful moments like this in the future if I wasn't going to carry out this journey in obedience. God called Moses to go back to Egypt to free his people. But Moses had no interest in going back to Egypt. He had just left Egypt. He was now on the other side of the country doing his thing. He had a life in Egypt, but that didn't go so well, and he wanted out. But God had different plans for Moses, where Moses was in a position of thinking, I don't need Egypt. I don't need these people. I don't need that life. God had another plan in store for him. God spoke to Moses in Exodus chapter 3 and said, "And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." And that was the beginning for Moses of bringing God's people out of Egypt. And eventually where we started in this message today of them crossing over the Jordan into that promised land. But Moses was not always so obedient. In fact, when he had just started out on the journey, something really interesting, really strange happened. And if you look in chapter 4, just one chapter later, in Exodus 4:24, it says, at a lodging place on the way to this mission that Moses was going to free God's people. I can't think of a more important mission on planet Earth at this time. Moses was God's guy. And it says this, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him. About to kill Moses while Moses is on this journey back to Egypt to free God's people, the greatest mission of all time. What's going on here? Well, if you keep reading, you'll learn that Moses had forgotten to circumcise his son. His wife, Zipporah, steps in, she takes care of it, and God allows Moses to live. You see, obedience has to happen even in what might seem the little things. God cares about the big things, and he cares about the little things. I'm sure Moses, thinking about this big mission ahead of him, he was going off back to Egypt to do something really, really big for God. These other small things, they can wait. For us to live in his hand, to fully surrender, to be able to live a life where we love and we've just laid everything down and we are fully in him, loving with all of our heart, our soul, and our strength, because we are right in the middle of his hand. We've got to be willing to sacrifice, and we've got to be willing to obey, because he knows the plan. He sees the big picture. We all know the story of David and Goliath. David, this young, smaller man, maybe even a teenager, and Goliath, this giant of a Philistine, who single-handedly had the entire army of Israel cowering behind the battle line. David wasn't having it. He showed up there to bring lunch to his brothers who were soldiers. David, not even on the battlefield at the time, decided he was going to take care of business. So he had his sling and he found some smooth stones and he stepped out across that battle line. And here's what it says in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 48. As the Philistine moved closer, talking about Goliath, to attack him, David ran toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from its sheath. And after he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. It's so important that we face our challenges, because how we face the challenge in front of us now sets the tone for how we face the next challenge and the next challenge. And David continued to face challenges. One challenge he faced after this was that the very king who praised him for killing Goliath, who brought him in, made him a son of his own, began to hate David because he was growing in fame. And God had anointed David to take over in Saul's place. So Saul set out to kill David, but David overcame. But although David was willing to face these challenges, there's still one that we can read about that he failed to face. It says here in 2 Samuel chapter 11, one evening David got up from his bed, walked around the roof of the palace. From the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Then she went back home. David stood up against a giant, opposing an entire army. In this moment, he failed with this giant that probably seemed like a very small thing to David. But again, God wants all of us. This is where it all comes together. We've got to be willing to sacrifice, to obey, and to face any challenge. That is living in God's hand, because again, it's us dying to ourselves, laying ourselves down, and placing ourselves in His hands. It's here that He can begin to use us. We've all heard the right tool for the right job, but what's better is the right tool in the right hand. You and I can be used by God as a tool to make an impact in this world, but it must be the right tool in the right hand. We must stay in God's hand. It says in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 12, "For if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have." You see, it's the willingness over the record, because we all have things in our past that make us feel like we're inadequate. Mistakes that we just read about here with Abraham, like we read about with Moses, and like we read about with David. But yet these men were an example of sacrifice, of obedience, of facing the challenges. It's the willingness over the record. My best life is a life full of loving Him, of laying myself down and placing myself in His hands. And it's that place of love and blessing that we are made whole and full. Our heart is full. Our soul is full. Our strength is full. That is only possible if we fully surrender, laying our life down in His hands.